Hi everyone, this is Grandmaster Nils Grandelius from Sweden, bringing you around 12 candidates recap. It was a very eventful day today for sure. As you can see here, all of the games were decisive, which I think might even be a record for these kind of events. And the games themselves were also very, very interesting. In my opinion, a game of the day has to go to Giri for his win against Caruana, but also the other games were quite nice. But let's start with Caruana Giri. It was Sicilian. Very interestingly, Giri switches to the e6. A couple of rounds ago against MVL, he played the Sveshnikov variation, but faced knight d5. And this is also what Fabiano played against Magnus in the World Championship match. So here he plays e6, and after d4 takes, the knight's out. White could play knight db5, which traditionally has been the main move. But then after d6, bishop f4, e5. They are reaching a Sveshnikov after bishop g5, but without White having the possibility to play knight d5 here, because the bishop is hanging, of course. So he actually intends to play the Sveshnikov still, as in the last game, but just wanting to avoid maybe the most critical line. But Caruana counter-surprise with a3, and now after bishop e7 they reached a typical Scheveningen kind of position with d6. Here Caruana, actually after thinking for a bit, or thinking on the previous move, decided to play a relatively strange setup with queen d3, which makes some sense, but also I think was mainly intending to get Giri out of book, because Giri is usually very, very well prepared. So Giri also spent some time, played bishop d7, now f4, e5. And here knight b3 was definitely an option, but after e takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight e5. The point of the white setup would probably be to get the queen to the g3 square, where it in these positions tend to stand very well. Unfortunately here for white it does not work, because black can take on e4, and on the next move there is bishop h4, winning the queen. So it does not quite work. For that reason Caruana took on c6, b takes c6, and now with this open b file it would be very, very scary to castle long. Like, let's say long castle, maybe queen a5 followed by some rook to b8. Even opening with d5 is a possibility, and I mean, even being in a must-win situation, I would not trust this at all for white, and Caruana certainly didn't. Instead he castled short, which makes a lot of sense. E takes f4, bishop takes f4, bishop e6 with idea to go with the knight to e5, queen g3. And here, as many people online were mentioning, the best move for black is a very surprising one, the best move according to the computers. That is the move h5, which is very, very high class, and I would be very surprised if even these top players would find the move in a game. So the idea in itself is pretty straightforward, and once you see it, it makes a lot of sense. At least I think so. The point is basically just to go h4, kick the queen away from the perfect square on g3, and then continue with business as otherwise plans. For instance, king h1, h4. And once the queen retreats, then knight d7, go to e5, and black is fine. Instead he went knight d7 immediately. Rook a d1, rook e8. Here another very interesting move was b4 immediately, not wasting a move on king h1 as in the game. I think generally speaking white is now doing quite well, but a position that is quite difficult to play in practice. Instead, after king h1, Giri found a nice move with queen b8, intending to put the knight on e5 without problems on the d file. And now I think it was a fairly important decision here by Caruana, which I don't quite like. I think something slow like b3 would be the best for white, especially in the situation, because now he's not going all in as quickly. For instance, if black places the knight on e5, then something like bishop h5, the knight is coming to d4 next maybe. Well, it's going to be a long game, but it's going to be a game in which black does not have any immediate counterplay, and seems to me that that white should be doing quite well. And also regarding the must-win situation, it's a position that I think Caruana would be quite happy with. But he decided to go for the sharpest way with b4, knight e5 b5 to get the knight to d5. But Geary reacted in a very classy way here with rook c8, and after takes knight d5, not taking the knight immediately, which would give white quite a nice initiative, but rather just defending with queen f8 slowly, sort of cementing the position, protecting the bishop, protecting any tricks against the king. Just now a very stable position for black with a strong knight, the open c-file. And I can see that the engine is of the opinion that this is equal, but in practical play I think there are very few players who would pick white here. Add this to the fact that Caruana is in a must-win situation, and yeah, it's really an uphill struggle. So he played c3, rook a c8, rook c1. This is already a clear sign that things are not going well. Knight g6, and here he decided to keep more pieces with bishop d2. I think something like bishop g4, trying to trade everything, was the best option, but then again, with a draw he's very unlikely to win the candidate, so he had to gamble a bit. But Geary was merciless in the rest. He actually played this part very, very nicely. Bishop h4, some rook c5, c4. Now a very nice move, h6, simply intending to trade the bishops and then cementing the knight on e5, which cannot be stopped because white is so passive and does not really have any breaks. So queen b3, bishop g5, takes, and yeah, by every move, like the advantage is getting bigger, and the counterplay is getting less and less, and well, even now the engine is now in complete agreement that this is like more than +1, which is a serious advantage. And I think on the level where they are playing now, it's I think you are much more likely to win the game than it ending in a draw here. And well, queen g3, queen d8, rook cd1. Here there are a couple of options, but very straightforward. What Geary did, just eliminated the knight, put the knight on f4, and yeah, with the dark squares, the c4 pawn being very weak, and especially the lack of counterplay, I think this is just a matter of technique. So queen f2, rook c7, another nice move, protecting f7, making the knight available for other duties rather than blocking the f-file. Rook d4, queen e8, bishop f3, and now he decided to cash in with rook a4, based on the cute tactic that, for instance, after queen c7, rook takes a3, queen takes d6. There is the move rook takes f3, which leads to an immediate win after, for instance, g takes f3, queen e2, attacking the rook, but also attacking the pawn on f3. So white retreated to f2. Rook takes a3, h4, but this is just lost. Queen e5 takes. I will show just one more position, because here it actually was quite funny. It was move 40. Geary was calculating, and he decided to play the move rook a2, which looks very, very fancy. The point being that if white takes, then there is queen h4, then queen takes e1 and pick up the bishop on e4. But he completely, I mean, he did not miss, but he miscalculated white's reply, because white now played rook b1, Caruana played rook b1, and now if the queen is captured, there is back rank mate. But his intention actually after rook b1 was to play queen h5 check. So the king has to go to g1 and then knight e2 check. with ID after king f1 that white is checkmated. But when he was starting to think after rook b1, he immediately realized that of course white can take on e2, giving the queen, and no matter how black recaptures, then there is a mate on the back rank. So yeah, instead he had to after rook b1 he had to retreat, but the position is so dominating that it really does not matter. He's still in complete control. And after rook e1, same position, he instead played f5, and yeah, bishop retreated, king f7, now rook h8 cannot really be stopped, and a nice final touch was knight takes g2, with the point that after rook g3 there is queen c1, check, and after king takes g2 there is checkmate on h1, so white resigned after knight takes g2. So a very convincing win by Giri. I mean, in a different tournament situation, it is likely that Karane would have tried to be more solid and hold. But still, a very, excellent game, and it's also nice to see how well Giri is playing currently. The other game that was relatively straightforward, actually, was MVL. Alexenko decided to surprise a bit with the Caro-Kann, but after d5, MVL counter-surprised to play the move f3, which has actually gotten a little bit of a burst in popularity lately. It's called the fantasy variation. So you are solidifying the center and then want to develop without black being able to break the center up. D takes e4, f takes e4, this is all very well known theory. e5, knight f3, bishop g4 also has been played numerous times. c3, and here quite a frequent move is knight d7. It's by far the main move, a little bit more flexible than the move was played that was played in the game. Just going bishop d6, maybe queen e7, and then develop with knight f6. Instead, Alexenko played knight f6 immediately, but that after bishop c4 is a little bit trickier, because now there are some tactical ideas. For instance, if it's white to play, then bishop takes f7 is pretty strong. Here, apparently bishop h5 is the best move, protecting f7, but it is a little bit strange to play unprovoked. To play it before h3. So instead queen c7 was played, but MVL now reacted in a very strong way. D takes e5. In order to recapture, black has to take on f3. Queen takes f3, queen takes e5, and the next move by MVL was also very, very nice. Bishop f4. Now, the point is, if black captures, yes, he was able to trade queens, but after knight d2, the black king is stuck in the center, and it will not be in time to escape. Yes, white will castle long, bring the rook to h2 e1, and black is simply stuck. So this does not work. But after queen h5, which was played in the game, white has the bishop pair, white has a lead in development, and it's an overwhelming advantage actually already. Knight d2, knight bd7, long castle. Here, you cannot really castle long, because then the f7 pawn will be very weak. But also, if you don't castle long, then it's quite slow to, for instance, castle short. So Alexenko played knight b6, bishop b3, bishop e7 in order to castle on the next move. Here is maybe the only point where MVL might not have played the best, but what he did was definitely good enough. He played rook h1 with ID to push g4, basically forcing black to take on f3. G takes f3. Now the pawn on g7 is attacked. Short castle will not do because of bishop h6. At least it's very, very dangerous. So g6 was played, and now this was actually a pretty interesting moment, because now usually when you have the two bishops against bishop and knight, you should try to keep your other knight, because somehow the two knights, they are often getting in the way of each other. But MVL decided to trade with knight c4, allowing black to capture, and he did this because black now cannot castle long ever because of the d1 rook, and if black castles short, then it's quite likely that white will be able to get his rook to d7, for instance, after playing e5 first, and then rook d7 will be coming soon, and this is just crushing. So Alexenko played b5, bishop b3, and here he made what I thought was actually a very reasonable try. He played knight d7, allowing bishop takes f7, king takes f7, rook takes d7, white has won a pawn, but a lot of the pawns are on light squares. I mean, a lot of the black pawns, they are all on light squares, especially after a5, a4. Combined with bishops being on dark squares and black's king in the center, it's not that easy a win, I thought. I thought this could very well be ending up in some fortress. I was, while following the game, a little bit worried actually for MVL that he did not get the most out of his advantage. Rook c7, rook c8, created rooks, bishop e3, a5. I said the pawn really belongs to a4. King d2, a4, f4. I think it's not super relevant exactly in which order the move comes now, but this actually surprised me a little bit when he played c5, but I guess he simply could not see any other way to stop white from playing c4, and after black tries to keep it blocked with b4, white can play c5 and get his rook to c4. So, for instance, something like this, and the rook is coming to c4, and all of the pawns are very weak. So he decided to play c5, but it's putting a pawn on the same color as the bishop, a little bit, or very risky at the very least. So c4, b4, king e2, and now Alexenko did decide to just wait, allowing MVL to trade the rooks, and it turns out that after having provoked this c5 before on dark squares, it's just winning. So probably trying to be active in a different way, but it's hard to believe. I think MVL has, even though it looked a little bit strange to me to go for this pawn, it turns out to be definitely good enough. So yeah, and after the trade of rooks, it's a fairly straightforward win, because you can simply go b3, and I mean, it looks pretty blocked. Had these pawns been on the reversed colors, like let's say they were all one step up, so they were on black's pawns were on the opposite color of the bishops, then probably it would be very good chances for a fortress. But here he plays king g4, threatening f5, so black has to play h5, king f3, and the problem is now that you cannot keep the bishop out forever, and after bishop d6, e5, the king comes to e4, and it will always be a zugzwang. So for instance here, if black now waits, then bishop f8, there bishop d6, and in order to keep the pawn protected, you cannot go back with the king, because king d5 will enter and then e6, so you have to sort of wait with bishop a7, but now after bishop c7 the bishop does not have any squares at all, so this should be over. And with such a bad bishop, you know, even after king d7, even something like king d5 is quite crushing, because king f7, e6, e7 cannot be stopped. The bishop is simply way too bad on a7. So nice technical performance by MVL. I was a little bit skeptical by bishop takes f7, but I guess he proved me completely wrong afterwards or during the game. Another game was Ding's win against Grishuk in this line of the Queen's Gambit that has been seen really a lot. Knight b7, so black intends to play c5, so white takes the chance to gain space. Now you can go c6 immediately and then b6, a5, similar to the game, or start knight h5, which he did. This is for me a little bit strange. Why Grishuk, in a situation where he definitely needs to win, goes for something so solid and so intended to hold a draw, but probably he thought that anyway it's too difficult to do anything about Ding, so at least try to not lose the game. All this has been seen many times. All these things are very nuanced. It's very subtle, but generally speaking, white has a slight advantage, a slight edge, but it's very, very hard to break the black position down. So Ding starts with h4. This is very typical. Gaining space, because long term it is on the king side where something should happen. Here, slightly surprising by Grishuk to play h6. I think a little bit more usual is to play g6, because then you have the bishop on dark squares and the pawns on light squares, and you try to be solid like that. But he played h6. Now some very subtle maneuvering battle happened. g3, intending later to bring the king to g2, also protecting f4. Bishop c4, b5, rook e1. Now rook a7. And okay, you should not be fooled by the computer evaluation of minus 0.1 after the next move, because it is absolutely clear that that white is the one pressing and black is just waiting, trying not to allow any breaks, and no doubt that that white is enjoying a pleasant position. Although again, with top players, usually this ends up being drawn much more often than white winning, but it's very, very rare that you see black win in such a position. Rook a8, typical, trying to double. Now a takes b4 is a threat, so rook b1 and takes. Black has now gained control of the a file, which he generally uses in order to achieve more trades, to be honest. That's the main advantage of having the a file. But you cannot really enter, because the knight is covering a2, covering a4, and the rook on a3 in itself is not really doing much, because you cannot get additional pressure on the knight on c3. So, I mean, it's nice to have the file, but you also cannot really do anything with it. So, black took on d3, bishop f6. Now, probably Ding was thinking that at some point black might change his mind and play g6 after all, so h5 makes a lot of sense, cementing the structure. All this, I mean, I'm going through quite quickly, because first of all it's very, very subtle and hard to understand, and also a little bit less dramatic than the other games, let's say. So queen c2, bishop e7, as we can see, Grishuk is waiting. Then generally speaking, if you are just going back and forth and the opponent can improve, it's a bad sign, which I think is true also here. But we shouldn't forget that it's quite possible that that there is simply no way forward, so he keeps waiting. Also, a player like Ding, he's never in a rush in a position like this. He improves very slowly, but I think his long-term idea here is to at some point trade the both rooks, and then only then later. Like, I mean, it's very easy here as white to believe that, okay, on the queen side I cannot do anything because black has the a file, so I have to push something like g4, g5, and you play something like queen e3, and next move you play g4, and next move you play g5, and you try to break black down immediately, and then you will get there will be some counter blow in the center, and you will lose control completely. That is a very likely scenario, and something that I have experienced myself many times. Therefore, it's quite nice to see Ding playing moves like rook bb2, just very slowly, improving the position, keeping everything under control, and it does not matter if g4 comes on the next move or in 30 moves. If anything, it's more likely to succeed in 30 moves, so a very nice thing to keep patience. Here, bishop d2, bishop d8, and now this maneuver is quite interesting that he starts. He plays knight b1. Of course, not so important that the rook is attacked because it will just move. But the point is that the knight on c3 was not really doing that much. But in the game, it can come to b3 or even to f3 after the other knight moves. So knight e5, knight f6. If black takes, I think actually both captures are quite reasonable. You can take with the f-pawn, then try to push f4, f5. This now makes a big difference that the pawn is on h6 and white's pawn on h5 rather than black having the pawns, for instance, on g6 and h5. Because then it would be very hard for white to break through with f5. But here, it's quite difficult to stop. But also, to take with the d pawn and then get this very, very nice square on d4 for the knight makes a lot of sense. And again, black's bishop is very passive here, so I think it's not really in black's interest to take on e5 this early, especially not with h6. So instead he tried to get the bishop to c7, but if black were now to take, then again d takes is interesting with knight e4, but also f takes and just block the a file with knight a5 next makes a lot of sense. So understandably Grishuk waits. Ding continues with the knight maneuver. Now he wants to go to d3. And well, as you can see on the evaluation bar, nothing much has happened. It's still relatively equal, but from a human perspective, and the advantage is also still in white's hand. Like nothing special has really happened. It's still white who is the only one who can try anything and try to make progress. So now finally Ding starts to move the pawns. f3, rook. Well, king on the light square, to me it looks a little bit more normal than on f2, but again it does not matter that much. And if he wants to, he can also just go back on the next move. But here he decides actually to act rook a2. And I think I would like to specifically mention something here. And this is move 38. This is very important, I think, for the decision. And this is something that very strong players have quite a nice feeling for. That Grishuk is down to almost no time at all. So it is quite tempting to make him having to do some difficult decisions before getting more time after move 40. So this is exactly what Ding is doing here now. He's initiating some action, trying to ask Grishuk how exactly are you intending to handle the situation, and he has to make the decisions before he gets this additional time. So quite nice timing after on move 38. Queen a8, knight c1, and Grishuk decides to take on a2, rook takes a2. Now we have move 40, and the Grishuk is not in time to correctly assess the consequences here, because they are quite subtle and quite long term, because the best move here is to play rook a4. And the big idea of this move is that if white tries to play the same as in the game with rook takes a4, then black can take with the b pawn. And in Zeitnot, with little time, it's not so easy to judge whether this pawn on a4 is actually a strong passed pawn that can promote later, or if it's a weakness that white can try to attack, like with queen a2, knight e2, knight c3. Here it turns out that this was actually the way forward, and the pawn is at least as strong as it is weak. Because instead after rook a3, now when white takes, queen d2, there is no counterplay on the a file, so white's play on the king side is pretty strong. Also the pawn is now hanging on c6, so if you have to retreat, then it would give white additional time, for instance knight d3, and sooner or later g5 will come, or even f5, and it will be quite difficult. Still, it was better than what he did, because after bishop takes e5, d takes e5, knight d7, knight e2, the knight came to d4, and with such a nice knight, especially if black has to go passive with knight b8, I think white will just break through on the king side. So Grishuk tried a bit desperate with f6, but it's not that easy to trick Ding with tactics in a position where he's dominant. So takes e5, just f takes e5, f takes g7, and queen c3, and yeah, Grishuk actually resigned, which is very understandable, because something like this I mean, yes, it's for the time being only one pawn, but let's say something like knight e2, king f6, knight d4, black has to play knight b8, so the knight can never move. White will make a waiting move and then just, with the help of Zugzwang, but even without, just play g5, and it's completely winning. So very understandable to resign. The final game is, in my opinion, the strangest game, or a little bit strange, because, well, Nepo, very understandably, having 1 year for preparation and being in the lead, he decides to abandon his Sicilian, his usual Najdorf, instead goes for the Petrov, which is very boring, or could be very boring, but could also be, or is also very well suited when you try to be solid and need a draw. And I think this came as a surprise for Wang Hao, because here he shies away from the main debates, plays d3. Now, actually, we have transposed to an exchange French, which is quite well known to be solid for black. But we should one interesting thing here after bishop d3, bishop d6, queen e2, is that this was actually played in the first part of the candidates, like last year, a little bit more than a year ago, between Grishuk with white and Wang Hao with black. So he already experienced some difficulties with black here. That's probably why he went for it. But it turned out that Nepo was very well prepared. Went queen e7. And this ending, if you don't know what you are doing, it can be quite tricky for black, actually. So white has some pressure on the e-file. And also the king is prematurely in the center, possibly. But Nepo played knight c6 at basically immediately, which was a little bit of a surprise for Wang Hao. He decided to play c3, h6 in order to stop bishop g5. Here, Wang Hao did think for a bit and went for the critical way to take the bishop with knight h4, rook e8, knight f5. But I think Nepo had simply prepared these kind of positions and understood that even though it looks pretty good for white at first glance, probably had deeper understanding and had a clear idea of how he wanted to place his pieces in order to equalize. Now Wang Hao did play the move g3, which is quite natural, because if at some point you want to play knight d2, you have to reckon with the possibility of bishop f4 in order to trade bishops, and the only reason that white would have anything at all in this position is the two bishops. So if black is allowed to trade one of the bishops, they could basically just agree a draw. So therefore g3 to stop that. But after knight e7, Wang Hao went with the bishop to h3, and although it does not look so important, it turned out to be one of the key factors in the game, because, well, they all made some very natural moves. The structure is now quite symmetrical. Rook d1, h5. Here, after knight f3, then the e4 square is quite nice for black. So Wang Hao played knight f1 in order to have f3. So g6, f3. Quite ambitious. He does not want to trade knights. But this in combination with the bishop on h3 is a little bit... I mean, it looks very clumsy, actually. And Nepo manages to demonstrate this quite well in the game. Knight b6, hinting at the c4 square, so b3. All this is just very, very logical. They are bringing their pieces into the game, trying to activate them. But bishop g5 is also a little bit, I think, a step in the wrong direction, because it's not so clear what the bishop is doing there. So turns out that both bishops are misplaced, and I'm not sure exactly what went wrong for Wang Hao, but it's clear that he lost track, because now he goes back with the rook to e1, and after knight e6, I mean, if he wants to be solid, he can always just trade and play in equal position, but he still has hope, so he plays bishop e3, rook c8, and now actually Nepo is intending to play c5, I think. And this probably made Wang Hao panic a little bit, because now, having played bishop e3 on the previous move, he decides to go bishop d2 in order after c5 to be able to take and play king g2. So with the bishop on e3 he would have had to trade bishops. Now he can keep his bishop pair. But Nepo handles the situation quite well, because he shows that the pawn on d5 is not very weak at all. Rather, it's the pawn on c3 that is weak, and especially the lack of coordination with the bishop on h3 and the knight on f1 shows that if anyone, actually black is the one putting pressure. And this is a little bit reminiscent of the game between Magnus and Fabi in the World Championship match in another Petrov, which was quite equal, but then Fabi played c5 and actually took over the initiative. So rook b1, rook c6, freeing up the c7 square for the knight without the rook hanging. So takes. And here, I assume that Nepo expected bishop takes c3, after which the game would most probably end very soon in a draw. But very smartly by Nepo, he actually decides to keep the game going for a while. Plays knight d6, with the point that after rook b3 he has d4. So takes on d4, rook c2. And due to this pin after rook d3, knight c4, black picks up a piece. So instead Wang Hao had to play bishop rook a7, but now this ending is... Oh, sorry, he played bishop d7 first. Even if it takes, it's probably even worse because the bishop is bad. So bishop d7, he trades, and it does look like it's pretty close to a draw. But you still have to be a little bit accurate with white, and he wasn't. Also, he was quite a bit lower on time. So he played rook e7, and this allowed Nepo to go rook c2 check, king g1, and d4. Now suddenly the pawn on d4 is very strong. And white is very passive with the king and the knight. So he did his best to get counterplay with the a pawn. Nepo increased pressure with h4. I mean, yeah, h4 to increase the pressure, h3, a7. But now the pawn on h3 creates a lot of mating attacks, mating ideas, and this is very, very scary for white. And like king e7 also makes a lot of sense to stop the rook from coming to d8. So now he's threatening maybe d3. And you absolutely should not be tricked by this evaluation of minus 0.2, because this position is super scary for white to play in practice. Because you are playing basically without king, and it's very, very hard to activate the knight as well. So g4, knight d6. He decides to sacrifice a7 in order to get the d-pawn. But the problem is that even after getting the d-pawn, black still has an initiative. And knight c4, it's simply very hard to activate the pieces, and you cannot get at the h3 pawn. So knight g3, check, king h1, and now king f8 in order to bring the king the other way. Rook c3, knight b2. This is just, I mean, it's so difficult to defend in practical play. Rook c8, king g7, rook d8, rook f2. Now there is no longer any way to defend f3, so king g1 takes, knight e4, rook e3. And well, the engine is indicating that knight d6 still gives white some hope for survival, but it's, I mean, there are so many problems in white's position, like the pawn on h3, these two pieces are not coordinating, the idea of bringing the king to g5, so I'm sure that you will not win with black against the computer, but in a practical game I would be thinking that the likeliness of a win is greater than a draw. Instead, he went back to g3, which is even more passive, and after rook a3, yeah, it's there is simply no way, and there are no. I mean, he simply had enough. Yeah, it's just too depressing. So a very convincing. I mean, actually a very well played game by Nepo. I mean, it does influence a bit that white needed to win the game, but definitely the moves speaks for themselves. Like, no matter the situation, no matter the standings, then I mean, the way Nepo handled this game, handled the situation against the bishop pair, the maneuvers, it was just very impressive. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this recap, and we are definitely everyone looking forward to the last two rounds. Yeah, see you around.